from Seoul, the city of apartments that climb to the skies. Some of these buildings are 69 stories high. Zoom into the very center of Seoul. There's a tiny area where apartments haven't taken over. It kind of looks like Godzilla's footprint. Here in the heart of Seoul, surrounded by cement arms stretching upwards, sit 100-year-old traditional houses called hanoks. They're 1 story high, and the locals call this area Island of Hanoks. Seoul's oldest neighborhood, and this is where I grew up. Zooming closer, this is my childhood home. I remember the day when we moved into this house. My parents and my 2 younger brothers. I was 11. It was a big deal for us because my parents had worked very hard to save for a down payment. When my dad met my mom for the first time, it was love at first sight, but they were penniless. On their wedding day, my dad had no wedding ring. My maternal grandma must have been like, "And you call yourself my son-in-law?" She ran out and bought one of those cheap rings from a street vendor instead of a real wedding band to seal the deal. True love doesn't cost much. For my parents, it cost $1. What a bargain. So my parents had no time to take us places, had no energy to tell us bedtime stories. We barely had time to go to the bathroom because they wanted the 3 of us to work hard too so we could become successful. That meant no toys, no TV, no fun activities. Pretty much most favorite things a kid could want, those were off limits. But one thing that I could not stop was drawing. One day my dad caught me drawing. He said, "Stop wasting time and study." So I had to study. And when I wasn't studying, I needed to study even harder. Did I mention that I need to study a lot? So I pretended to study while imagining and making up stories in my head and drawing in secret. The background in my room that looks like a prison bars is a rice paper door. A good thing about rice paper door is that you could hear any noise coming from outside. If I heard somebody coming, I would stop drawing and hide the evidence. I didn't want to get caught drawing again. I became a ninja artist under house arrest. Hiya! Luckily, there are other people living in my hanok, total strangers who became our residents. Our family used only 3 rooms out of 10. It was also a big deal for us because we had never lived in more than 2 rooms for this house. Since I was the oldest child, I bullied my way into my own bedroom. The rest of the rooms were rented to other families. Some families rented 2 rooms, but most families had rented just 1. They would live in these rooms for 3 to 4 years. We were like one big community in a single house. I know how sardines in a can feel. But it was a typical housing situation for many Koreans back then, before apartment buildings started rising. So I was in the constant presence of others living under one roof, my roof. There are multiple stories going on in my 1-story hanok. Every family had a story. They didn't tell them, they showed them. It was like living in a never-ending reality show. I was thrown out of my own confinement to feel the experiences of others and to see the world through their eyes. Once 2 grandpas living in my hanok fought over a pair of underpants. Both had owned identical ones, apparently. I never knew how much people loved their underwear until I met these 2 grandpas. One claimed that the other grandpa had taken his pair hung in the laundry line. He pointed at this distinctive mark, a permanent stain on his pants. "That's my stain." Normally, a person would deny any type of butt stain on their underwear, but this grandpa identified himself with it. The other grandpa sealed his lips tightly and ignored him. "Do you accusing Grandpa?" He said, "I'd rather talk to a deaf cow." I felt their ego. A single mother who ran a noodle shop lived with her teenage son. My own brothers and I called him Big Brother. We would linger around waiting for him to finish the comic books about Taekwondo robot he had rented from a comic book rental store so we could read them. Otherwise, the only time that we could get into comics were the occasional Sundays when we skipped church and used the offering coin Mom gave us to rent comic books ourselves. It was my first business venture with a great return on investment, but risky. Reading a comic book was also considered wasting time. The Big Brother never told my mom about it. I felt his support. A bus driver lived with his girlfriend for 3 years and moved out. 2 years later, the police showed up at our door to investigate. His girlfriend had left him, and he had started gambling, and he had borrowed $10,000 from a group of gangsters, and then the gang threatened to kill him if he didn't pay them back. So he kidnapped a college student for ransom and ended up killing her. That could have never happened in my house because there are always people around. It was odd to hear such terrible news of him. I remembered him as a nice, quiet man. I felt his despair. We had a couple of single women in their 20s. They worked at a Yojong, a female entertainment house. They often wore these beautiful Korean traditional dresses to go to work. They were so elegant, and they always smiled at me. One of them had come from a poor rural farm and sent her family money every month. Years later, she invited me and my mom to her new house she had bought by saving diligently. I felt her pride. One grandma told us scary stories. The real horror was that the stories had really happened. She said the streets of Seoul were filled with corpses during the Korean War. Dead women sprawled on their backs, dead men lying on their stomach. And in the summertime, holes would appear in their bodies within a week. She would go on with her eyewitness details of how the human body decomposed. It was like her memory was getting sharper as she aged. I felt her terror. Another grandma had Alzheimer's. One night, she went around and around the same narrow alley. Either she was lost or she was out on patrol protecting our neighborhood. Anyway, our next door neighbor brought her back to us. Years later, when I visited home from the US, she not only recognized me, but she took out $10 bill, all wrinkled up from a pocket, and gave it to me to welcome me back. I was like, "Thank you, Ninja Grandma." I felt back home. Zoom out of Seoul. I told my parents I was going to the US to study. I put myself in an art school in New York City. I had completed my ninja school. Finally, I could draw freely. I became a children's book writer and illustrator. When my first book came out, my parents thought I had become an artist overnight. They couldn't believe it. So I drew something quickly to show off. My brother was impressed. "That's a nice cow you drew." I was like, "No, it's Grandma." My dad asked me to read my book aloud. He dozed off while I was reading. I told him not every children's book story is a bedtime story. He asked me how I wrote the story. Little did he know that the residents in my hanok had taught me 3 key things for storytelling over the years. 1, in every story, the character faces a problem, just like all of us. At our house, had a lot of problems. 2, We don't know how the story will end, just like our lives. We all tell stories with our lives in the way we live, but none of us knows what will happen tomorrow. Our lives are a mystery story. 3, no character stands alone. Yes, a great character grows through struggles, but the character needs help through those hard times. Even a hero needs others to be a hero. Even the artist. As a child, I was not allowed to make art freely, but the community in my Hanok opened up a pathway for flexible thinking. My house fostered natural interaction that allowed my subconscious mind to explore the diversity of emotions and thoughts. We share much joy, sorrow, brokenness, and resilience. Being aware of each other's gain and pain made us more able to go on. And we saw what was special in each other. It not only helped me cultivate empathy, but it also increased my individual creative capacity. All emotions are relational. Emotional intuition is critical in the creative process because these emotional prompts are often associated with high levels of energy and they fuel creativity. We think that the creative types are solitary individuals racking their brains in their caves, like Dr. Seuss's The Grinch. Yes, spending time in my own head was important in the process. Yes, intrinsic motivation drove me to create, but the extrinsic motivators can further reinforce innate drives. The interconnectedness of people in my Hanok inspired me to tell and draw from the heart and share with the world outside of the island of Hanok. John Donne wrote 400 years ago, "No man is an island entire of itself." It leads us to the power of a community in the flow of life. Without community, we cannot actualize or realize our innate potential, gifts, and passions, and in turn, give it back to the world, which is really our greatest community. To be human is to be creative. Express and understand and connect. That is the heart of creativity. That is also the spirit of community. Where will you find your own story? Thank you.